All right, gents, it's time for another tier list.
I hope you have something good prepared this time.
Yeah, the last list wasn't the best.
Not to worry, guys. In celebration of the newly released Zelda game, Tears of the Kingdom, I figured we should rank all the dungeons from Ocarina of Time.
Such a good game.
Yeah, that game was such an important part of my childhood.
Your childhood? Joe, the game released in 1998.
That's your opinion, Donald, and I respect it. Let's proceed with the ranking, starting with the Deku Tree.
Hold on there, Joe. I will be doing the narration.
Fine.
All right, first up, we have the Great Deku Tree, the very first dungeon of the game.
As a first dungeon, I think it's absolutely perfect.
I agree. The place is not too big and not too small. Not too difficult to navigate, but no cakewalk either.
And it has an assortment of rooms all dedicated to teaching the player a new mechanic.
And each of those rooms has a puzzle that incentivizes the player to think for themselves.
Who can forget that one puzzle where you have to lower the water, jump on a moving platform, and kneel under the spiked log?
Yeah, that puzzle was kind of tricky. Tricky, but fair.
Just the layout of the dungeon is so perfect. You're climbing up this hollow tree, and when you reach the top, you jump down the middle through the spider web and into a whole new section.
Such a great memory. The pacing is overall on point. Each and every moment you're doing something new.
And the boss is no slouch either.
The boss is pretty terrifying. A giant spider with one eye that crawls around on the ceiling.
It's a spider? I thought it looked more like a crab.
Crab looks more like a hand, actually.
It looks a bit like a hand crab.
What the hell are you guys talking about? The whole tree is infested with spider webs. Of course it's a spider.
Donald is probably right, but we're not here to discuss the anatomy of the boss. We're here to discuss the dungeon. I myself could comfortably place the Deku Tree in A tier.
I agree. The dungeon is too small and not complex enough for S tier, but it certainly is a fantastic starting dungeon.
I agree with both of you. Put it in A.
All right, let's move on to Dodongos Cavern.
When I first walked into that place, I felt a certain dread creeping up my back.
Yeah, the creepy ambient music and the giant skull in the back of the cave really set the stage.
I felt the dungeon never really lived up to the potential it set during those first seconds after you enter it. The layout is fairly linear, and the challenges just aren't that interesting.
Not to speak of the dungeon item, which is just a bomb bag. Now, don't get me wrong, I love bombs, but compared to the other items you get in the game, they're fairly lacking.
And that one puzzle where you have to blow up a wall by throwing a bomb just right so it sticks to a ledge. Just terrible.
Oh, don't even mention it.
The mini-boss of the dungeon is pretty good, though.
Yeah, I agree. Too bad the actual boss is lackluster.
King Dodongo has to be the most disappointing boss in the game. He's far too easy.
Absolutely. When you first enter the dungeon, you're expecting to fight this big, menacing monster. Then it turns out all you do is chuck bombs into his mouth.
I suppose that's a given since it's the second dungeon, but even Goma was harder.
So where do we place the dungeon? I can comfortably say that it is perfectly average.
I agree. The dungeon isn't great, but not terrible. Just about the definition of mid.
Very well. We all seem to agree that this dungeon belongs in B tier. Moving on to Lord Jabu Jabu.
I hate to say it, but I feel this dungeon is even worse than Dodongo's Cavern.
It's more disgusting, at least. The walls are all pulsating like flesh, and the doors. Don't get me started on the doors.
The most memorable thing about this dungeon is the outside. I was always afraid that falling into the water around Jabu Jabu would cause him to eat me.
He does eat you when you enter the dungeon, though. But I get what you mean.
I think the biggest problem with the dungeon is the layout and the art design. Running around inside Jabu Jabu's intestines just isn't very visually pleasing. And the layout makes the dungeon feel too much like a video game.
Fully agreed. The idea of running around inside an organic structure sounds good on paper, but the execution is way off.
You guys make some solid points, but the actual worst part of the dungeon is running around while carrying Princess Ruto.
Yeah, that Ruto part was mind-boggling. It's a shame Nintendo didn't add in a way to kill her.
It's pretty cool that you can kill other enemies with her, though.
Yeah, that's true.
What about the bosses? I don't particularly enjoy any of them.
No, none of them are any good. The Octorok mini-boss is just a constant sprint around a circle, which is unsurprisingly not fun.
Yeah, and the fight against Baronade is just too chaotic and tedious. Though using the boomerang was pretty cool.
Yeah, the boomerang is a great item. Too bad it's obsolete after this dungeon.
It's really strange that adult Link can't throw a boomerang. Anyway, I personally feel that this dungeon belongs in D tier.
That seems a bit harsh.
No, Barry is right. Outside of the boomerang, there really isn't anything positive I can say about the dungeon, which is not true for any of the others.
I guess you're right. Put it in D then.
All right. We're officially moving on from Child Link dungeons to Adult Link dungeons.
An unforgettable moment. I remember it as if it were yesterday, walking up to the pedestal in the Temple of Time. With both hands, Link gripped the hilt and pulled the majestic subscribe button out of the stone.
Joe, what the hell are you talking about?
Suddenly, he's standing there as an adult, with the red blade in hand.
Joe!
Sorry, I got carried away.
He pulled out the Master Sword, Joe. You know it. I know it. Everyone knows it. Let's move on to the Forest Temple.
The Forest Temple perfectly mimics the Great Deku Tree. It was a fantastic start to the game as Child Link, and this is an even better start to the game as Adult Link. The dungeon is a masterclass of game design.
This dungeon is so good, I always feel joy at the thought of replaying it.
It is phenomenal, no doubt. From the eerie music to the fantastic layout, I struggle to find any flaws with this temple.
Except for the key hidden at the top of the tree above the entrance. That is some bullshit that I often forget, and I end up getting stuck.
That key is stupid, I agree, but everything else is flawless.
I love that the temple has a central room you come back to multiple times. It makes the whole place feel much more real.
And who could forget the Poe Hunt? Having the player hunt for Poes by completing unique puzzles really ensures that the player is never bored.
Even the rooms themselves are unique, especially the ones with the wall masters.
God, those things still make me shit myself, even to this day.
Yeah, same. Those creepy hands gave me nightmares as a kid.
Stop with that played it as a kid bullshit, Joe. You were like 600 years old when the game released.
No, I wasn't.
Joe, you were born before video games were even invented. Cut it out.
I disagree with that statement.
What do you guys think of the boss?
It's magnificent. Phantom Ganon is leagues above any other boss the player has faced thus far.
Absolutely. He's not too difficult and not too easy. He also has two completely different phases, and none of them are a simple hack and slash.
Agreed. Love that fight. Overall, I think I would place the Forest Temple in S tier. Any objections to that?
No, it's S for me too.
Same.
Great. Next up is the Fire Temple.
Definitely better than Dodongos Cavern.
Oh, for sure. The trip into the Fire Temple feels a lot more meaningful with freeing the Gorons and putting an end to Volvagia.
And the layout is just overall more enjoyable, though not as good as the Forest Temple, I would argue.
I agree with that. It's fun to explore and has a few neat gimmicks, but aside from the odd firewall here and there, I feel it never really utilizes the fire theme.
That's a good point. It could very well have been any other temple.
You can't disagree that it houses one of the most unsettling enemies in the game, though.
Which enemy?
The like.
Oh yeah, those disgusting worm things that swallow you whole. They freak me out.
Creepy and disgusting things. They eat your stuff, too. What do we think of the boss?
Volvagia, it's a pretty decent boss, but a bit too scripted for my taste.
Yeah, it's cool that it requires the use of the Megaton Hammer, but much of the time you just wait for the boss to pop out of one of the holes.
I'm inclined to agree. It's definitely a step down from Phantom Ganon. I think the dungeon as a whole is a step down from the Forest Temple.
In the same way that Dodongos Cavern is a step down from the Great Deku Tree.
Yeah, the Fire Temple is good, but not great. I would put it in A tier.
A tier seems fine. Any thoughts, Donald?
Personally, for me, it's a B, but I'm willing to compromise on this one.
Very good, Donald, placing it in A. The next temple is the Water Temple, but let us take a detour through the Ice Cavern first.
Forgot about that place. Quick and easy, but nothing to write home about.
The most memorable thing about the place is the fact that Lord Jabu Jabu is gone. I always wondered what happened to him.
That and the room where you fight the boss, it looks pretty cool.
True that. I'd say C tier.
You think it's better than Lord Jabu Jabu?
I do, actually. Unlike Jabu Jabu, the Ice Cavern is over before it gets annoying.
I would say that it's D tier.
No, Donald has a point. It's in no way a fantastic dungeon, but it is only a mini dungeon. We got to rank it accordingly.
Fine, I'll agree with C then.
Good. That brings us to the famed Water Temple.
Chuck it in D tier and let's move on.
Hold your horses there, Joe. The Water Temple is an underrated gem.
Are you insane? The whole place is a tedious, convoluted mess and is impossible to navigate.
Sounds like someone has a bit of a skill issue.
I'm really curious about what positive things you have to say about the game's most hated dungeon, Donald.
Well, first off, the layout is pretty good.
Now you're just trolling. The layout is horrendous.
Shut up, Joe.
The layout is good because everything is interconnected to one central room where you raise and lower the water level to gain access to different sections. It makes the whole temple feel a lot less linear.
That design is the problem, though. There is no clear indication of where you're supposed to go, so you keep going back to the same room.
People that aren't senile are actually able to remember where they've been, Joe.
I got to agree with Joe here. The layout is unnecessarily confusing. Raising the water level, coupled with changing back and forth between normal boots and iron boots, Makes the whole temple a bit too tedious.
They fixed the iron boots issue in the 3DS version.
True, but we're not ranking that.
One thing I will concede is that the mini boss is pretty cool.
Yes, Joe, thank you. Coolest mini boss in the game.
The concept is cool, but the execution is off. Dark Link is pretty much impossible to beat in a straight fight.
I always beat him with Megaton Hammer Cheese.
Everyone does that. Got to give props to the room you fight him in, though.
Yeah, that room is lit. And the item you get after him, the long shot, is probably the best item in the game.
Hard to agree on that, but speaking of bosses, what about Morpha?
Morpha sucks, no questions asked.
That boss is so pathetic. The path leading to it is 10 times harder than the boss itself.
That path is absolute hell, but what is Morpha even supposed to be?
Some bacteria or some shit. Listen, guys, I know it's popular to hate on the water temple, but I honestly think it belongs in B tier.
You think it's better than Lord Jabu and the Ice Cavern?
Yes, 100%.
I cannot agree with B tier, as there are a few too many things dragging it down, but I can accept that it is not absolute trash. The best I can do is C tier.
I still firmly believe it is D tier, but if it makes Donald happy, I can agree to C tier.
Thank you, Joe. You're a good friend. I owe you one.
Very well, placing the water temple in C tier. Can't say I saw that coming. Before the Shadow Temple, we have another detour through the bottom of the well mini dungeon.
A detour through Nightmare Land, you mean?
Yeah, this place haunted my dreams for years as a kid.
Joe, for the last time, you did not play this game as a kid.
Yes, I did, and you just said that you owe me one. I want you to accept that I played this game as a kid and then we're square.
I will do it for this one dungeon, but that's it. I'm a rational man and I cannot stand for this bullshit.
That is acceptable.
This is ridiculous. I think we can all agree that the place is terrifying.
Especially as a kid.
Yes, Joe, I imagine that is true.
The thing about this place is that you feel so helpless since you're playing as Child Link.
Can you imagine how scary it was for Kid Me to be playing as Kid Link in this place?
I'm not answering that.
It's especially nerve-wracking because parts of the floor are fake, causing you to fall through to the re-deads.
That was always my biggest fear as a kid.
The boss is the worst thing, though. All those creepy hands trying to grab you before that disgusting thing pops out of the ground.
I still have nightmares about that thing ever since I was a kid.
Can we just rank this place and get it over with? I'm going insane.
Yes, please. It's a B for me. It does all the things Ice Cavern does, but better.
I agree. Creepy atmosphere, short and sweet, disgusting boss, and a great dungeon item.
When I was a kid, I would have probably placed this in D tier, out of fear. But as a grown man, I recognize that it belongs in B tier.
Grown man? Joe, you're 80 years old. By any definition, you should be considered ancient.
Putting it in B so we can move on to the Shadow Temple?
The grown-up version of the bottom of the well.
You know, as a kid...
Enough. Joe, we're done with your kid antics.
Yeah, our deal was only for the last dungeon.
I'm just going to start off by saying that this temple is pretty good.
I agree. I think my first time playing through this was my favorite dungeon.
I also thought it was the best dungeon first time through. But I have realized that much of the novelty wears off during subsequent playthroughs.
How so?
Well, for one, the dungeon item is acquired at the very start, meaning the dungeon has no natural midpoint.
That is true.
And the dungeon is very linear, with all the puzzles contained to a single room.
Starting to sound like you hate the dungeon, Joe.
Not at all. I think it's good, just not top tier.
The atmosphere is good, and the boss is very interesting. I also think the dungeon plays with its theme very well.
Absolutely. I think the biggest detriment to the dungeon is that the game itself is rated E for everyone.
I agree. The dungeon is very good for what it is, but I feel Nintendo could have made it even better with a higher rating.
It's starting to sound like a B tier from you guys.
It's more of an A for me.
Me too. The dungeon is very enjoyable, but it barely misses the mark for top tier.
A tier it is, then. The next dungeon is the Spirit Temple.
S for Spirit Temple, S tier, no doubt.
I cannot for the life of me think of anything negative to say about this temple.
What about the dungeon item?
Which one? There's two.
Well, both of them.
They're a bit lackluster.
I agree. They're both utility items used in very specific situations. Acquiring them doesn't really change the game in any way.
But the fact that there are two items is cool in and of itself.
That's right. And out of all the dungeons in the game, the Spirit Temple is the only one to utilize the time travel mechanic.
Exactly. Having to travel through the temple once as Child Link, then again as Adult Link is just brilliant.
And traveling through it is such a joy as well. It reminds me of the Forest Temple in that each room feels unique with its own kind of puzzle.
And it all culminates with probably the finest boss in the entire game, Twin Rova.
Twin Rova is so hot.
She is green, Joe.
I don't care.
Suit yourself. I would love to discuss this temple for hours on end, but I think we all agree that this belongs in S tier.
Absolutely, no doubt. Throw it in S.
I like it when we agree. It makes me happy.
Good for you, Joe. Let us move on to the final dungeon, Ganon's Castle.
This dungeon certainly is a dungeon.
One of the dungeons of all time.
You don't like it?
It could have been better.
I agree. The dungeon lacks its own identity, leaning too heavily on the dungeons that came before.
But the showdown with Ganon is so epic.
It is, but that is just a small part of the dungeon. We are ranking it as a whole.
And as a whole, it does nothing that hasn't been done before.
Well, the tower part is a bit unique, but it's just an enemy gauntlet, so it's nothing special.
You guys may be right, but I found the whole experience to be fun.
And we are happy on your behalf, Joe. But the truth is, the dungeon feels more like a mini dungeon than a real dungeon.
Couldn't agree more. The final dungeon was done way better in Twilight Princess.
Absolutely. All in all, I would place Ganon's Castle in C tier. Thoughts on that?
C fits well with me. It's fine, but a bit below average, since it pretty much copy-pasted what came before.
I would have said A tier.
I'm definitely not putting it in A tier.
Yeah, that's way too high.
You can't place it with the water temple and the ice cavern. It's better than both of them.
Not in my book.
We can stretch it to low B tier as a compromise. The dungeon isn't terrible, just bland.
Low B is fine, but that better be super low B.
I'm fine with that.
Good. Putting it in B. We'll just have to imagine that it is super low B. And there we have it, guys. We pulled through.
Yeah, that went better than I thought it would.
It sure did. What should we do next?
No idea. I hope someone will leave a suggestion.